Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited. Isis, All That Glitters. The goddess next door takes on a bikini-clad bank robber in this action-packed, all-new Isis series adventure. Get Isis, All That Glitters in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today. If black comic fans and comic fans of color wanted to talk about racism in the comic book industry, all they'd have to do is point a finger at DC Comics president and co-publisher Dan Didio, because your Dan Didio over the last 15 years or more has received the greatest case of white privilege I have ever seen a white man receive. In the over last 15 years, your Dan Didio has managed to literally destroy the DC Comics publishing division and destroy the reputation of the DC Comics brand. However, your Dan Didio still manages to remain on the job after failing numerous times. If that's not white privilege, then I don't know what is, because if your Dan Didio was a black man or Hispanic man or even an Asian man in that leadership position, he would have been terminated years ago. However, when it comes down to this man, he continues to get a pass, whereas other creators of color would never get that pass at all. And if this isn't white privilege, I don't know what is. And when I take a critical look at your Dan Didio's resume, the white privilege shows right there. I mean, here we have an individual who is given the job of being a president of DC Comics and an editor-in-chief, even though he has never had any sort of publishing experience whatsoever. If that's not white privilege, then I don't know what is. Because if a black man decided to apply for that job like myself, there would be all of these white people going out of their way to scrutinize my background and scrutinize my education and ask a whole bunch of questions about it. But this man, who has never worked in a trade publishing house, knew nothing about the publishing industry, this man was hired to run your DC Comics publishing division. And that's, as I see it, a clear case of white privilege, because no black man would ever get that pass whatsoever. And as this man was given that pass to run DC Comics with no publishing experience, people continued to give him a pass, even as he started making very poor business decisions as related to the DC Comics brand, such as the storyline Graduation Day, which your Donna Troy was murdered off in this event in a very, very poorly executed fashion, which showed your Dan Didio had no understanding of the DC universe. He had no understanding of the structures of storytelling, and he had no understanding of the publishing business model. Your Dan Didio thought that, he could make this dark, dreary, depressing story model similar to what he thought Marvel Comics was all about, and he thought he could implement this and bring in all of these new readers, even though readers were starting to get turned off as early as your Graduation Day event, which started, I believe, in 2002, and then in 2004, they really started getting angry when he launched this Identity Crisis storyline, where we got the revelation that your Sue Dibney was a victim of sexual violence, and superheroes who were known to be truly icons like your Flash, your Green Arrow, your Hawkman, and many others, Zatanna, would go out here and mind wipe a woman who has been sexually violated, and your Batman was being mind wiped as well. And this was the storyline this man wanted to promote as a major event, and this event alienated a lot of veteran readers of DC Comics who knew that this was not the way these heroes would behave, and it alienated a lot of casual readers, because when you see a woman who has been violated like this And it's just a turnoff to even hear that type of story and to hear heroes covering it up. It's all quite disturbing. And no Warner Brothers executives ever went to this man and said to him, you know, this story is really creepy. This story is really weird. And if you're the guy who proposed that we need a rape, it's time for you to go. I mean, this is, again, another case of white privilege going on, because this guy, he goes out here, proposes a rape in a comic book, and the Warner Brothers executives give him a pass. And they give him more of a pass even as they see the sales numbers of DC Comics declining and see this man canceling books that are actually selling, like the Tim Drake Robin book at the time and the Nightwing book, both of them which were selling very strongly. He just canceled them arbitrarily because he just doesn't like them. And as those sales are going down, he continues to put one more event after another, like your Infinite Crisis, your Final Crisis, and then takes us to Flashpoint, and the sales numbers continue to go down, yet this man continues to remain employed. Now, as he's failing downward and the DC brand is going downhill, they decide to make Jim Lee his co-publisher in an effort to stave off the failure. Unfortunately, your Jim Lee, even though he had some publishing experience, ran the Wildstorm comic imprint he ran completely bankrupt. So we had an incompetent white man being shored up by an Asian man, and it still was not working out. Again, showing us the white privilege your Dan Dido has as a white male, and the complete pass this man has been given over the course of, I say, 5 to 7 years. A pass, again, a black man wouldn't get, because within 3 to 6 months, management would be all over that black man, insisting that he get things right, or he would be terminated, or in the case of many black men, if they were heterosexual black men, they would have been terminated within 3 to 6 months for not meeting the standards that, or the goals that were expected of them. But your Dan Dido he just gets a pass, even though he continues to drive the DC Comics brand downward, and he continues to drive the sales downward. And to give him an opportunity to clean up his mess that he made with the DC universe, what they do is go into Flashpoint, launch the New 52, and wind up alienating even more comic fans. And this New 52 leads to DC Comics literally winding up in a state of free fall that literally damages the overall DC Comics brand, to the point where DC Comics can't even sell merchandise like t-shirts and action figures, a part of their division which was doing consistently well until your Dan Dido came along. But when he comes along, launches the New 52, even the licensing and merchandising begins to suffer. And this man continues to get pass after pass, even after he has literally destroyed the DC Comics brand, and his business model has managed to even damage the DC Comics brand as related to film properties, because all of the stories based on your Dan Dido's dark, dreary, depressing model, like your Man of Steel, your Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice, and Justice League, were all based on his model. They all failed, and this man is still managed to have a job. Again, just shows the power of white privilege over at Warner Brothers, and how this man has that power of white privilege, because even after failing for over a decade, he still manages to have an executive position at your DC Comics. And even after they brought in Jeff Johns to try to fix much of the damage that your Dan Dido's leadership did to the DC Comics brand with Rebirth, what happens is he winds up back in charge after Jeff Johns is given another position as related to DC Comics products and properties. And once he's back in charge, he goes right about failing upwards one more again. And he shows how incompetent he is by signing your Brian Michael Bendis to this multi-year, very expensive contract to write Superman comics, and gives your Brian Michael Bendis his own Wonder Comics imprint, both of which have managed to start failing. And it just shows how incompetent your Dan Dido is, because he didn't do his research on your Brian Michael Bendis, a man who has clearly shown that he has lost his passion as a writer, lost his skill set, because all he had to do was head over to a comic shop, pick up a couple of issues of that absolutely horrifically terrible Iron Man run that your Brian Michael Bendis recently did, or even just look at some of those Jessica Jones comics that he used to write, and or even some of his New Avengers books, and you would just know that Brian Michael Bendis was not a good fit, and you would know that his skills were on the decline. But your Dan Dido signs him because he's a known name in the comic book field. Now, as a publisher, I would have never signed such a contract, because this guy, just looking at his work, was just not on the level where he was capable of producing consistent quality work anymore. All you would have to do is look at many of those Riri Williams Iron Man books to see that. And if you're a publisher with a budget, you don't want to risk money on that type of person. But your Dan Dido, nobody ever asks him what's going on here, because you've already started, you've been failing for years, and they just give you back the reins of DC Comics to continue failing again. You start failing again, and again, no Warner Brothers brass pulls this man's chain to hold him in any way sort of accountable. And even though he's been screwing up for over a decade and a half at this point, and he's managed to destroy the momentum of several books, like the Superman books, which were starting to gain some traction again, and the Super Sons book, which was starting to gain a following. So he derails both of those books, and not both of those books, about 3 or 4 books which are selling, which is in the publishing business, is something that would get you fired from your editorial position, because if you, in the publishing business, you need those 10% of books that sell to pay for the 90% that fail. But your Dan Dido continues to get a pass, and that pass just shows, again, the power of white privilege this man has had almost for 2 decades now, and how that white privilege is just not seen by many people in the comic book world. I don't know, because when I look at the stories that your Dan Dido has managed to bring back, and that dreary, depressing story model, which has driven people away from top-selling books like Batman and Superman, which were selling consistently well over the course of the last year or so, it just shows that at DC Comics, there's a clear case of white privilege over there, because, again, if this was a black man and he was failing within the first 90 days, he would have been terminated within those 90 days just for making one minor mistake, like coming in 5 minutes late if his car got stuck on the freeway. That's the double standard I see going on over at DC Comics. If you had a black person in charge, they would be held to a higher standard than your Dan Dido, who has been over at DC Comics failing nearly for over 2 decades now, because ever since he came to DC Comics in 2002, the brand has never managed to pick up any sort of momentum, and it has been on a serious state of decline. Before he came to DC Comics was a very competitive brand, and DC Comics publishing imprint was managing to sell consistently on the regular. However, after he comes to DC Comics, he destroys the classic DC universe with a series of bad storylines and bad business decisions, and then brings in a new universe which manages to alienate just about everyone. Jeff Johns manages to come in, clean up the mess, and start bringing things back. Then, when Jeff Johns leaves, he comes back and starts messing things up again. But most people will sit there and say, oh, there's no racism in the comic book industry. Everything is on merit. Well, if we are looking at things based on the merits of your Dan Dido's accomplishments, we can only say that there has to be some sort of racism in this comic book industry for this man to have remained employed as long as he has and to have remained in charge as long as he has. Because when you have an individual who has failed not once but twice once put back in charge, that's a case of white privilege if I've ever seen one, and it's a case of white privilege that, as I see it, needs to be called out. Now, there are many in the comic book industry who say that DC Comics could have been worse without Dan Dido, but I have to shudder to think how bad it could be if there's somebody worse than him. Because if you have an industry and this guy who has no publishing experience is considered the best they could do, then I have to really look at that and say that that argument does not wash with me. There has to be, with all of these comic fans out there and many of these professional people in the publishing world who understand publishing and understand the story models and writing, there has to be someone out there who is qualified to run DC Comics. But the thing that I think is the problem is over at DC Comics and Warner Brothers is that they're too scared to take a risk on somebody new in an effort to try to keep what they have. Unfortunately, what's happening now by keeping this man in charge is that they're not going to have anything in the long term. Because with your Dan Dido, as I see it, again, this is a case of white privilege if I ever saw one, and it's about white males trying to hold on to power on the DC Comics brand instead of them looking for a qualified leader who can go out here and rebuild this brand into something of quality that can reach new readers, reach new customers, and help them try to reestablish DC's once storied reputation. Because when I look at your Dan Dido, if this isn't white privilege, I don't know what is. Because only in the case of white privilege can someone continue to fail over 2 decades and still manage to have a job. Because I guarantee you, if this was anybody else who was black, this man would have been gone in the first 90 days over something trivial, because that's how dysfunctional the double standards probably are as related to the comic book industry. Because as I see it, if Dan Dido was black and he was starting to screw up like this, most comic fans would have not only been calling for his head, they would have gotten that head in those first 90 days. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct publications, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.